Actually, does my camera have like a spot for a mic? The answer is yes, but my mic doesn't, the mic that I have doesn't work with it. So, next investment, a mic that works with my camera. Welcome back, it's Riot from Night Riot Cosplays. I know it's been a while since I last updated on my YouTube, but I'm here today with another tutorial. Today I'm showing you guys the whole process I went through to make my hat and the wig for Blossoming Starlight Klee. I absolutely fell in love with this character, even as like, I'm almost 20, so even as a 19, almost 20-year-old, the character just looks so cute, so I was like, this cosplay has to get done. I fell in love with it. It got done. This is part 1 of a 3-part series of how I made the entire cosplay. Part 1 will be the hat and the wig, and then part 2 will be the entirety of the outfit, and part 3 I'll be covering how I made her bag, and any other questions that y'all might have from the comments I'll be answering in part 3 as well. I hope you guys enjoy the video. I'm still kind of working out the process of how I want these videos to look and kind of like my style when it comes to video editing, so this video might look a little bit different than the first one, but not to worry, eventually I will find my groove and everything will start to look like a normal YouTube video, not something thrown together. So yeah, that's all I have. Let's get started. First things first, we have to start with a pattern. It was very hard to find a perfect pattern for this Klee hat because she has such a distinct cone shape on the top. But I tried to find a pattern as close as I could to that. So here I printed out, I printed out, and I'm taped together, and then I cut out a pattern from Lumen's Workshop. It's one of their free patterns. And it's going to serve as the base for our Klee hat pattern. Here the pattern was actually going to end up being a little bit too big for my head, so I'm cutting down the center of my patterns and then overlapping them enough that it will fit around my head instead. You can see I'm trying to find the center of the pattern. Generally, when you're trying to make patterns bigger or smaller, you want to find the center of it, cut it down that center line, and then add material or take away material from the middles. With the resizing done, I can start working on the patterns, trying to change them to get the correct shape of the cone part of the hat. So once everything was overlapped, I drew lines about where I wanted this cone part to end up, trying to follow the shape of the pattern that was already there. Essentially what I had to do though was just shorten the pattern a lot and then make it just a little bit less curved out to the side. The one important thing to remember when doing this is that you have to make sure that lengthwise the sides will match up. So what you'll see me here do is I measure one side of the pattern, and then to the corresponding side where I'm supposed to glue it to, I will measure that same side and make sure that those two measurements match, because that means then that my foam will match up together when I glue it together. With the measurements and the reshaping done, it is time to play foam Tetris, where we take our patterns and we start transferring them to our EVA foam, making sure that once you're done tracing one side, you flip the pattern over and trace it the other way so that you can have 2 mirror pieces to make the whole brim. The pattern does only give you 3 pieces, so even on the original pattern, you would need to flip it over to make the mirror side. With everything cut out, we can start gluing together all of our pieces. Here you'll see me also gluing together the brim, or you'll see pieces of the brim starting to get glued together. Ignore that. I did not end up having to glue together the brim pieces, and you'll see why in a second. But for the actual cone part of the hat, I start gluing it together, gluing the 3 pieces on one side together, then the other 3, and then connecting them at the center. Making sure that I am doing this over my heat gun so I can mold the foam together to make it easier to glue, because this is going to be a curved surface, so the heat gun will help soften the foam and give it a lot more ease when trying to glue those pesky parts together. Here you can see where I messed up on the brim. I did the 8 pieces like the pattern said, but it ended up actually being A, way too big for my head, and B, it only made half of the pattern, or at least about half of the brim. And when I tried to connect the 2 pieces instead, it ended up being too small for my head. So no matter what I did with gluing these pieces together like this normally, it would have been too big or too small. And I did not have any more foam to continue making brim pieces, so I had to get creative. This is the result of my creativity. I ended up finishing up gluing together the brim, and once that was done, I set it down and I placed the brim pieces about evenly spaced around the cone part. And then to fill in the gaps to start the shape, I just took a lot of duct tape pieces and started duct taping everything together, making sure that as I went from inside the innermost circle of the brim to the outermost circle, I overlapped the layers. Once everything was kind of stuck in place where I didn't need the brim anymore, I took it out of the way because it is kind of in the way of everything, and I finished taping everything, and then I flipped the brim over. You need to make sure you are taping both sides, aka putting tape on those gaps, so that it has a little bit more structure to it instead of just having one wobbly piece of tape. Once I flipped the brim over and made sure that both sides got tape on those spaces, you can kind of see here where the tape is overlapping from underneath, because you need to make sure you're sticking tape on tape. Once that was done, I went through and I placed wire around the outside of the brim. I think I did 3 or 4 rows of wire, and I taped it down. This not only adds structure, but it also gives us the ability to bend the hat a little bit, and it'll keep its shape without having to form the foam too much, without having to like heat it up and fold it over, bend it around to get it into the right shape, and then letting it cool down like that. This allows for it to permanently hold its shape without as much work, which is going to be really helpful because we are not actually going to be painting this hat. Before we start with the fabric though, there was one piece left that we needed to cut out of EVA foam. So I took the brim and I traced half of the brim out onto a piece of paper, or pieces of paper I taped together. These are all scrap papers from when I was cutting out the pattern. I keep all of those scraps and then just kind of Frankenstein them together so I don't waste as much. And then I go in and I freehand this kind of petaled flower shape that Klee has as a detail on the top of her hat. With that flower pattern cut out, I transferred it or traced it onto 3mm EVA foam. It's important that with this foam you choose a little bit of a thinner one, because we're going to actually end up sewing through it, and stuff like 5 or 10mm EVA foam will be a lot harder to sew through. So I ended up going out and buying some 3mm EVA foam. This was one of the only things that I ended up buying for this project, was just this 3mm EVA foam, because I had run out of my 2mm. After all of that work and everything finally being glued together and sized properly, and we made sure that it all fit, we have to cover everything with masking tape or any type of tape really to make a pattern for our fabric, especially because we altered the shape of the pattern for the comb part of the hat. We have to remake patterns for that. You could use the original ones, but they will not account for seam allowance and they won't be perfect. So I just prefer to layer masking tape on top and draw out especially my seam lines on there. It's just easier for me, but you can definitely use the patterns from before if you find that easier. Once I get the tape off, I cut along my seam lines, and then I transfer everything onto my fabric. There are 2 layers of fabric here, and then I just cut out the patterns from the fabric, just like you would any other sewing project. Also, please don't forget to add seam allowance when cutting out your pattern pieces. In the last clip you saw, there were 2 pieces for the brim in red, and we actually need 2 pieces for the brim in black as well. I only patterned half of the brim, so here I start by sewing together the 2 black pieces to get 1 full side of the brim, and then you do the same for the red pieces of the brim. Lastly, you also want to sew up the fabric for the cone part. Here I'm pinning together my dart that I put into the top of it to make sure that I got a nice cone shape. If you guys need a better explanation on how to do darts or making fabric tops for cone shapes, let me know and I can make a more detailed video on it. With all the sewing done, we have basically just made a bunch of huge socks to put over our foam pieces. So I started with the brim and I put the sock or the fabric parts over top of it, and then what I do is I pull the fabric so that it goes over the edge of the foam and into the inside, and then I pin it in place on the inside of the foam. You'll see why we do this in a second. Then we go ahead and do the same for the brim part. We put the fabric sock over it, making sure you have to pick a top and a bottom for the hat. For me, I decided that the top of the brim was going to be the side with the wire on it, and that's the side that I put the black fabric onto. Because the top of the brim is black in the photos and the reference pictures that I have, and then the bottom is red. So I put it so that the black fabric would be on what I decided to be the top. And then again here, you just pull the fabric to the insides of the foam. Here you have to like fold it under the foam, like if you're trying to hem something, and then you can pin it into place. Also, please make sure when you're doing this that you are clipping into your seam allowance, at least around the inside diameter of this curve, because it is a curve and it'd be way too much. It wouldn't sit right unless you clip into those seam allowances like you see me doing. Lastly, we also have to cover the little flower petal parts in our red fabric. So here I just lay the foam on top of the red fabric that I cut out, and then I go in and I start clipping corners. The rule of thumb for this is on curves that are like inward. I think it's concave curves, like the inside circle part. You have to clip into it only, just make small little slits. And then on the convex curves, or like the big kind of humps on the outside that make the petals, you need to cut out fabric. So you cut in little triangles to cut away a little bit more fabric. By making sure that we clip into our curves, we do put a lot more work on ourselves when we start pinning everything down, but in the end result, it does actually look better when you do this. Finally, with all our fabric pinned onto all of our foam, we can get to the actual gluing process. Here I'm using hot glue to glue down all the little tabs on the flower parts. This is the best footage I have of this, but essentially what I have is a little rubber finger protector. I make sure that my hot glue gun is as hot as it will go, and then I put a little bit of glue under the tab, and then as it starts to dry up, I spread it out with a little rubber finger to make sure that I'm not only stretching the fabric as much as it can to make sure that I'm getting the best look on the opposite side, but also making sure that I'm sealing the edge of the fabric onto the foam. The reason we're using hot glue is because if you've ever tried to glue fabric with hot glue, you'll see that it kind of sticks on it and it's really hard to get out. And the same goes for foam. If you put any foam on hot glue, it's very difficult to just peel it back off. It kind of like sinks into the foam, which is why we're using hot glue for both of these. By massaging it into the fibers, it is probably going to be the strongest glue option we have to glue fabric to foam. Once you're done gluing fabric to both flower petals, you can move on to the brim and the cone part of the hat, taking it slowly, just doing little strips of glue, little pieces, going around, making sure that it's sealed nicely. It is time consuming, but the end result is worth it. Before we can start gluing all of our pieces together, we have one last detail, which is the little embroidered parts, or like the stitching parts on the flowers. So what I do is, on the fabric, I take some tailor's chalk and I start marking about 2 centimeters apart all the way around the outside curve of the flower petal on both petals. Easiest way to do this stitched look on this petal is to do a running stitch throughout the entire edge. So I start by marking about a centimeter away from the edge of the first side of the flower petal, and then I mark how big I want my stitch to be on the top side, the visible side. For me it was about 2 inches, and then you have to mark how far apart you want each of your stitches. I believe I picked about 1 centimeter out. And then you make that pattern. You mark 1 centimeter and then you mark 2 centimeters apart all the way around the outside edge of both flower petals. Then you just have to pick some embroidery thread. I went for a red that was kind of lighter here because that's what the reference picture was. It showed like the stitching was a little bit lighter than the actual fabric. Then the trickiest part was trying to decide how to make sure that this shows up. Normally when using embroidery threads, you want to split the threads to make sure that you only have 3 strings in your hand, and then you double it over and tie a knot on the end. But because we needed our stitches to be pretty big and visible, what I did is I took all 6 strands, basically the normal amount of embroidery thread, the regular thickness, and I looped it into my very big tapestry needle. You need a huge tapestry needle to do this, a pretty thick one, to get through the hot glue and the foam. And then instead of just tying a knot, I left it as is, and I left the working end still wrapped up in the bundle of the embroidery thread like you can see here. And then you just start poking your needle through into the stitches to make your stitches, following the markings that you had made before. With this method of embroidering, you don't have to guess and keep tying off and cutting apart embroidery thread. You just kind of keep going all the way through, and then when you get to the end of the project, you just have to snip and tie off both ends. Then finally we can start gluing together all of our pieces. I start by gluing the brim to the cone part of the hat. I just do a line of glue around the outside of the brim on the bottom edge. I do a line of glue around it, and then I slip the brim on from over top going down, and then I just hold everything in place as much as I can while I wait for my glue to dry. And then once that base part is dry, I go through, and any parts that might not have sticked well, I go through and I glue it from the top. This line on top where the black meets the red, it doesn't have to be perfect, just because it's going to get covered by other fabrics and bows and pieces on top of it later. Once that's done, we can also go through and glue on both of our petals, making sure that the outside edge is firmly glued on so that we don't risk any peeling up of that foam. Now we are in the home stretch of this hat project. Second to last part of this project is to paint the flower on the underneath of the hat. To do this, I start by marking out with white chalk about where the pieces of the flower I want to go and the extra petal pieces. And then I tried like 8 different types of paints on this fabric that I had, and I ended up deciding that puffy paint was the way to go for this. You guys should definitely go ahead and make sure you're testing your paints on your fabrics, but for me puffy paint was the easiest. So on the outline, basically the chalk lines that I had drawn, I went in with puffy paint regularly and I left a puffy edge there. And then I take the puffy paint and I pour some out into a little tray, and I use it to start painting the insides of the petals, to adding a gradient from the inside to the outside like the reference picture shows. And then I do this to every single petal, including the tiny kind of like half peeking behind petals. Then I go in with a second layer of paint to make the inside of the petal closest to the actual hat wearing part, to make it more opaque there and to add a little bit more of a darker gradient going out as well. I wasn't completely happy with how I had left the artwork on the underside before, so I go in with some puffy paint and I start making streaks to add a little bit more dimension to it, and then I just take a brush and I brush out the edges so that it'll blend out a little bit better the closer it gets to the head wearing part. I also go in with puffy paint and I just make some thick dots on those tiny petals on the outside as well. Then I go in with one last coat of paint, making sure that the edges, the closest to my head, is as opaque as I can get it. Is it going to get seen? Probably future, not, but I know it's there, I just want to rise up, stronger, look back the ashes, please. All that's left for this hat project are the finishing touches, so I start by taking a lint roller and running it all over the fabric on the hat, making sure that I get all of the hot glue trails that I left behind. Then I go ahead and glue on the strip of fabric that goes around the outside of the brim cone connection part. This is why earlier we didn't need to make sure that the connection was super clean. It gets covered by this long strip of fabric. Then I can glue on all of the bows that go on the hat. I start by placing the bow with the vision on it. Then I move on to the back and glue on the bow there. Then I move back to the front and I glue on 3 bows in 3 different sizes that go on top of the vision bow. If you want to see how I made all of these bows, you'll actually have to go to the video where I make the entire outfit. This entire costume had so many bows on it that I just grouped them all together into one video. So if you want to see how I made the 3D printed parts, the bows, and the band that goes around the top of the hat, go watch the video on the outfit making. Finally, I run the lint roller over it one last time to clean up all the hot glue trails. And with a quick endurance test, our Blossoming Starlight Klee hat is done. With the hat out of the way, we can move on and start styling the wig for Klee. So here I'm using a Gaia in Natural Blonde from Epic Cosplay Wigs. So I start by sectioning off the bangs. It comes already pretty well pre-sectioned, so I just clip them away. And then I take out the ponytail and I separate some hair, and then making sure that I'm doing vertical sections. So instead of starting at the bottom and moving to the top of the wig, I'm starting on the left side of the wig and moving towards the right where the part is. So I section some medium-sized pieces from the left side, and then I split them in about half again, and that's about the size sections that we're going to start crimping. If we crimp this wig, it's going to help us get to the volume that Klee has in her pigtails much quicker, especially because the Epic's Gaia is a very silky smooth wig, and we need it to have a lot more floof for Klee. So to start crimping, the idea with crimping is that you want to essentially burn the marks into the hair lightly. Like, you want to singe the hair in order to get the volume that you need. So you start by taking your crimping iron and you make sure that it is at the highest level possible. With that, you can alternatively keep it at a lower temperature and just hold your iron in place for longer, or you can keep it at the highest temperature and then you quickly just pass the crimper down. Either way, essentially what you're looking for is to damage the fibers of the wig. That way when you brush them out, you get the frizzy texture. Essentially, you want to do that all around the wig, making sure that you keep the two pigtails parted separately because we need two pigtails anyway, so we don't want to mix in that hair. And you want to make sure that you also crimp the bangs. Then we are going to take the hair on one half, since the wig comes pre-parted. We're going to take all of the hair into our hand and smooth it out nicely, the top part, using hairspray and heat. I have a steamer off to the side, which I will run across the top of the wig every now and again to make sure that it stays nice and smooth and silky at the top. And then you want to pull it all into your hand, and we're going to use zip ties to hold it into place. You want to make sure when you're pulling all the hair into the ponytail, you're not grabbing the little tiny hairs that the wig comes already, like the wig already has some tiny baby hairs for the nape and the neck, so you want to make sure that you're not grabbing those and that you're leaving them out. If you're wondering why we're using zip ties, it's because it's actually a lot easier to tie a zip tie around the bundle of hair that we have in our hand than it is to try pull all of the hair through a ponytail or a hair tie and then loop it over and pull it through again. By using a zip tie, it's just going to make it a lot easier for us to make sure that we leave the top nice and silky with no bumps or anything. My zip ties actually ended up being a little bit too small to grab all of the hair, so I ended up having to connect two zip ties together and then putting that all around the hair and tying it. You want to make sure that you're going about a medium-ish tightness. Like, you don't want to go all the way down when you're tying it, but you also don't want to leave it too loose. So just keep that in mind when you're tying it. Once you have both parts of the hair tied into ponytails with your zip ties, we can start making the kind of bumped, kind of bulby shape that Klee has in her pigtails. So what I do is I take a hair tie, now we can use our hair ties, and I tie it about where I want the hair to end. So it's like I'm leaving a little bit of hair at the bottom because I'm going to trim that off later. So you tie the hair tie at the bottom, and then you start pulling out hair from the base and kind of making it poof up, similar to how you would do a bubble braid. Then once the hair is nice and spread out and I like the shape that it's in, I go in with my steamer and I steam the heck out of the ponytails, making sure that I'm getting every part of the ponytail is getting steam on it. This is the heat styling method for cosplay wigs. I personally like heat styling more than I like using hairspray, just because it doesn't leave like that crunchy texture if you use too much hairspray it has. I like being able to get the shapes without the crunchiness, so I heat style. Once I've made sure that every part of the little bubbles of Klee's ponytails are done, I let it sit for a couple hours to make sure that it dries down. Because essentially what you're doing with the steamer is you're getting the hair wet with hot water, like hot vapors, and you need to let it dry down before you take out the ponytails on the bottom, or you're going to lose all of the shape. Once the wig has dried down and it's cool to the touch, I trim off the bottom part of the wig that I didn't want to use anymore, and then I take the hair out of the ponytail. And I do this for both pigtails. Here you can kind of see how we're left with the bubble effect after heat styling everything. Then I go all around the pigtails, sectioning off the top layer of hair. This is going to be like the showy layer. Because we crimped the wig, there's a lot of volume in these pigtails now, and we really don't need all of it. So you go through and you separate and part out all of the top layers of hair. That's going to make the kind of, not exactly spikes, but the waviness that Klee has in her wig. And then that innermost layer, you are going to feather cut it to make it as thin as it possibly can be. So once everything is sectioned, I take a small sized chunk from the inside of the wig, and I kind of decide how short I want to make the inside fibers. And then I go through and I take my scissors and I slide them up and down the hair, almost like you're trying to tease the hair. But because you're using sharp blades to tease it, it's going to cut the hair. And then when you touch it, you should be able to feel how it's thicker at the top of the bundle of hair and how it gets thinner as you go to the bottom. That's what feather cutting does. It really thins out the hair, which is exactly what we need. With the inside done and cut shorter than the outside layers, I can finally let down the rest of the hair. And then I start using the end of my comb and start bringing all of the, like a little bundle of hair to a point to kind of make those wavy spikes that Klee has. Then once I have an idea of how I want the little wavy spike to look, I take my steamer in one hand and I run hot steam over the little section of hair, and then I use the end of my comb to bring the hairs together to a point and shape it in the way I want. Sometimes I will even take two combs and almost use them like chopsticks to get an extra little wavy part at the bottom. But you just repeat this process all around the pigtail until you have all of the little wavy spikes that you want for Klee's pigtail, and then you do the same on the other one. Once I'm happy with the pigtails, I just spray it with a little bit of hairspray, not too much, to keep the fibers in place while I move on to the bangs. For the bangs, I start by separating about where I want each piece to sit. Klee has like 4-ish bangs. She has 2 kind of longer ones by her ears, and then 2 face framing ones up on her forehead, and then finally the one middle one right in the center of her forehead. Once I've separated each section out, I go in and I take the topmost layers of the middle set of bangs and I separate it so that only a thin kind of bottom layer is left, and I feather cut here as well to take away some of the volume at the tips of her bangs. Because we have to spike this a little bit, we need to make sure we're thinning it out so that we get a nice spike. I know I said that you should be feather cutting this, and you should be. The smartest decision with these bangs would be to feather cut the ends so that you have hair at the bottom point, but it's just thinner. However, what I'm doing is point cutting the bangs, so it's like almost no extra volume right at the tips, which isn't the smartest way to do it. It's just how I decided to do it in the moment. Looking back, it definitely should be feather cut. Either way, once the bangs are sufficiently thin enough, I bring them to a point, and then I take some long like quilting pins and I pin the pointy bangs in place. And once again, I take my steamer and I run it all over the bangs, making sure that every part of it gets covered with the hot steam. And then once it's kind of hot to the touch the hair is, I let it sit in these pins until they become cool to the touch. If you did it right, when you take the pins out of place, the fibers should stay in generally the way that you had them pinned down. Sometimes, some shapes are just impossible for the gravity to keep it, so you have to go in and kind of trim up the edges a little bit. The important part when using hairspray for things like this, though, is that you want to make sure you are drying the hairspray. If you just spray hairspray onto the parts of your wig and then you leave it like that, the shape will not stay. You want to make sure you're using either a blow dryer to dry the hairspray, or you're softly blowing on the ends to make sure that the hairspray dries so that the shape will stay in the fibers. And that's what I do for all the sets of bangs. I just go through, and whatever didn't sit right after I took the pins out, I trimmed and I fixed however I could, and then I pointed everything nicely and made sure to hairspray the ends. After this point, I glued on the bows, which you'll see in a second. But when I was done with the bows, I realized that I wanted the wig to have a little bit of shine like a little kid might have. So I took a glitter like spray and I sprayed it all over the wigs to give it a little bit of shimmer. You should definitely do this before you put the bows on though, because I didn't realize until after I'd sprayed everything that the bows had gotten coated in the glitter as well. And then I dyed the tips of Klee's hair. She has like this kind of red gradient that goes at the bottom of her hair. Definitely do this before you put the bows on again. I don't know why I decided to put the bows on and then do the rest of this, but here we are. All I did was I took a spray bottle that I bought at the dollar store, and then I mixed acrylic paint with a little bit of water. I think I did 1 part paint to 2 parts water. There's not really a perfect ratio, but that's about what I did. Then I shook it up really well to make sure that the paint got really incorporated into the water, and I sprayed it onto the tips of the hair. I'm using a napkin here as a backboard so that I can make sure that the paint doesn't get onto the hair behind it when in places that I don't want. But once I have the hair kind of soaked a little bit in that water paint mixture, I go through and I really massage it in with my fingers so that it also doesn't leave kind of a hard crust on the end. If you massage it in, it will make sure that the hairs kind of stay a little bit more flowy, a little bit softer, and that all of the hair gets coated and you're not leaving it really blotchy. I should also note at this point that I did do Klee's little hair thingy on the end. It's just wire and a magnet that's holding it there, but when I competed with this costume, I didn't actually put the little hair thing on because it didn't look as good as I thought it did at this moment. I wasn't very happy with it. It didn't look good. It was falling apart when I finally got to the con, so I just ended up going without it. If you want a proper tutorial on how to do these, I definitely recommend going through TikTok and YouTube, which is where I tried to learn, but I just wasn't proud enough with the little hair flick to show you how I did it. At some point, I just said, screw the napkin. What I ended up doing was spraying the mixture onto my hand and making sure that it was kind of a puddle in my hand, and then I'd massage that into the bottom fibers of the wig. But once we are done dyeing the bottoms of all the bangs and the pigtails, we are done with Klee's wig. And that completes how I made the hat and the wig for Blossoming Starlight Klee. Thank you guys so much for watching till the end of the video. It really means a lot, especially because I'm still kind of a small cosplayer. I didn't think that a lot of people would want to see my process, but I thought it about time to start showing how I did certain things. If you guys have any questions about how I made any parts of this cosplay, leave them in the comments and I'll try and answer them in my next 2 videos. If you guys want to find my resources, like some free resources that I used in this entire process, or even find the files to all my 3D printed pieces for this cosplay, you guys can find my Patreon linked down below, and those files will be on there for you guys to see. Would it be horrible if I asked you guys to subscribe and like? Because I feel like everyone does that, but I don't want to be that person. No, I'm not gonna do it. Yeah, I'll see you guys for the next build. What? Oh, you're so pretty. She makes more than one cameo. She will make more than one cameo in this video. And the next 3. 2. The next 2. Oh my goodness! That's not safe. Get down from there. I think one of your whiskers went in my mouth. What made you think you could? Never mind.